This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary holy land from the heathen. This is Dan Baltic, and unfortunately, I am not joined by Matt this week, but I am very pleased to have on the pod for this very special episode 69. You have episode 69. Mark Marlow, the author of The Jackalopians, a modern tale, which is a really, really good satire novel that was published in 2022. And I read, it had been on my radar for a while. Mark has been on my radar for a while. And I finally, over the summer, sat down and read it. And honestly, one of the most impressive, best written novels to come out of our scene in the past, to come out of our scene, frankly. And, as someone who, for whom satire is near and dear to his heart, I really enjoyed it. And I was pleased to see that I'm not out there alone carrying the flame of satire to the dissident masses. So welcome to the pod, Mark.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. That's very high praise, so that means a lot to me. Thanks for those kind words. And I had no idea that this was going to be episode 69, so it's an even greater honor.
There you go. Yeah, it's the magic number.
Yep.
But yeah, no, it's when I first kind of like heard about the Jackalopians and you were describing it, I believe Enoch Powell, not the historical figure,
Yeah.
but the Twitter personality, wrote a review on Aristophanes is the Bullfrog. I believe that's the Substack that where he reviews books. It came to my attention that there is a satire out there, that it's an ambitious project, and it really piqued my interest. You have a very interesting cover of something that looks like a rabbit, but it has horns as antlers rather, and that is I've learned since reading this novel that is a jackalope.
That's right. Yeah, did you know what a jackalope was before you read this
I
novel?
did not know. I mean, like, I've heard
Interesting.
the phrase. I've heard like jackalope. I assumed it was just some sort of like
Yeah.
insult or something. Like you call someone a jackalope. But
Yeah, actually, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, well, you lived in New York your whole life, right? So
more or
maybe,
less, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so yeah, the jackalope, I guess, well, I can start in talking a little bit about the book, but the jackalope, I assume many people who would be interested in listening to this podcast may not have heard that. But it is a kind of mythical creature that lives out in the Western United States, a rabbit with antlers. The whole background of this is explained in my book, which is a serious book, by the way. I
Yeah.
think I don't know that I did myself a great service in naming a book, The Jackalopians, a Modern Tale, and then having a big picture of a rabbit with antlers on the cover. You tell people you wrote a political book that really exposes some of the big issues of our times. And then you also tell them it's called The Jackalopians, a Modern Tale. And they sometimes just think you're schizophrenic and then quick move to block you. But yeah, so the jackalope is kind of a mythical creature. It's like Bigfoot. It's kind of this American original type thing. It's different, I guess, than Bigfoot in the sense that nobody actually thinks it's real. It's kind of this product of roadside America that was created as like a tourist gimmick in the 1930s. And my book just takes a kind of spin on that idea, which I've always seen myself as being a real symbol of the historic America, the America that's getting lost and destroyed by the 21st century through the Biden administration, through the Black Lives Matter movement, the COVID lockdowns, and all of these real attacks on the historic America. I've personally always seen the jackalope as kind of a symbol of the America that's being lost. That's probably a position that's personal to me and that not that many other people can relate to, but I tried to put it together in a real, relatable, interesting story. So just kind of generally, because I'm assuming probably many people who are listening to this podcast have not read the book. but it's kind of a fun satirical look at the contemporary world. It's a kind of sprawling absurdist adventure story. And it starts out, it's about a guy named Dan Smith, who was a junior associate attorney, much like the guy that Dan Baltic always talks about bullying on his Twitter account. I actually wrote this book. It's kind of serendipitous. I wrote this before I had any idea who you were.
Mm.
So the junior associate part is purely coincidental. But it's about this guy who's kind of living his life
Mm.
in a not very great, but perfectly getting by for 2021 bugman type existence, living in a small apartment in Washington D.C., looking at porn, masturbating, trying to get over his breakup with his girlfriend, and he
All the
works.
classics.
Yeah. And he works at a big law firm, just working long hours, doing uninteresting stuff, surrounded by liberals all the time. And this guy, kind of in this spiritual malaise, through a mishap on a Zoom call, he comes into contact with this group called the Jackalopians, who are this kind of secret society of underground right-wing professionals like him working in the Washington, D.C. scene during the COVID era. But they have this secret society to basically drink and have fun together. It's spun to him as a political society, but then when he goes, he realizes that it's actually just mostly about worshiping this jackalope as kind of a symbol of the America that's being lost. And so that's the basic setup of the story. It's I would assume most would believe it's a kind of far-fetched story, but I actually think it's really true to life. Most of the people who I've talked to who have read it have praised it for being actually realistic, which I think is a great honor for people to say, because it's an unlikely story. But it does really get to all the issues of our times, I think, about BLM and COVID and really the kind of spiritual malaise that most people are living through.
Absolutely. And that's part of why I think the Jackalopians is so unique, so special, is that it is a somewhat satirical novel that satirizes the post-COVID and COVID era. And that is just something like novelists, it's really hard to write, to keep up with current events. So I feel novels are always a few years, maybe decades even behind. Whereas, I mean, this is, frankly, your novel is some of the first attempts to satirize in novelistic form, in literary form, the COVID era. And how did you find that process? Because one of what I see as one of the intrinsic challenges of satirizing COVID is how crazy and absurd it already is. So it's kind of like, how do you satirize an environment where people are like, I'm biking outside and wearing a mask. It's like it's already like insane, but you did a good job of it. So how did you find that process?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think it's an interesting issue, and it's, I think, something that's relatively easy to do poorly. So I'm happy that you thought I did well in it. I think that one of the ways that people fail in this, kind of like the Babylon Bee type model. I don't think the Babylon Bee is very funny. I think most people our age probably don't think it's funny either. Where I think the problem with a lot of that stuff is that it's trying to exaggerate what the left is doing and saying, like, wouldn't it be crazy if they took this position or something? But all of those examples that they use end up like 2 years later becoming rigid left-wing doctrine that you can get fired from your job if you don't believe. So you can't out satirize them or out absurd them, because everything they believe is already completely ridiculous. So I think I tried to take a different tack with my
Hmm.
book, where I didn't necessarily try to overstate what they're doing. I just tried to state in clinical terms what they actually did. And I think when you put it that way, it really shows how insane that whole time period was. And I mean, how insane our world still is. Um, like there was a great quote which I tried to find it in advance of this, but I couldn't find the full thing. But it was from Tolstoy talking about War and Peace, where he said, "It is not a novel, still less is it a history." So he was basically claiming that his book, which is clearly a novel, that it was part novel, part history, but also neither, without ever really claiming what it actually was. But I think that's kind of how I see the Jackalopians in a certain way, because in a certain way, it's just a record of what people were doing. Like there's a scene where Dan, the main character, encounters a Cuomo-sexual during a BLM riot. And I think the whole Cuomo-sexual movement is something that the left would probably prefer nobody remembers. But there was a time for a few months in 2020 when they were all talking about being like sexually attracted to Andrew Cuomo because of his perfect handling of COVID. And just
this is the craziest thing.
Yeah.
Like I knew a girl during that time who said like I'm like who expressed a sexual interest in Andrew Cuomo, and I was just like, this is insane.
Yeah. And so I think that you really need to remember that. Like part of the whole issue of pushing back against these people is just to remember what they've done in the past, because they often just disavow what they've done in the past. So partially, I think the book is just really building a historical record, and the humor in it, because even though it is a serious book, I think that covers a lot of important topics. It is at heart, I think, a funny book. I hope it's funny. The humor in it comes from just
Absolutely.
pointing out how crazy these people actually are and not trying to exaggerate or satirize in any kind of unrealistic way.
Exactly. What would you say your I mean, before we get to that, I want to highlight that it's just so refreshing to, in a weird way, to read writing that takes place and explains the sort of work from home. You at the beginning of the COVID thing, where people weren't sure, can we get close to each other? Can we not? And I believe the protagonist and his girlfriend break up over this issue, actually.
Yeah.
And later on, she finds a COVID boyfriend that she, essentially cheated on him with, and broke. She started cheating on him before she broke up with him, and it does kind of like you. I think what you have here in the part of it before it gets to the part where there's the BLM kind of like scandal event, and it's kind of the narrative gets turbocharged in the snapshot of like the whole COVID nonsense. You've captured a sort of like very strange period in American life where people were, just, I mean, like I knew a girl with wasn't a girl it wasn't my girlfriend or anything, but I knew a girl who had a COVID boyfriend, and she's just like, oh, this guy's, in my building. So, and
Yeah.
that was like, I remember like during COVID, like I was single then, and I was on the apps, and like suddenly I had women who were just like, it's incredibly horny, and they just like wanted to come over and just hook up. And it's like this is something that like during normal times, you don't get offers on like dating apps to be like, can I come to your place without meeting you?
Yeah.
As a guy, that just really doesn't happen very often. But like during this period and during COVID, like it's like it was a very strange social phenomenon, and the way that you've kind of captured the enormity of it in the this novel, and as well as like the continuing kind of enormity of it, because so the novel starts out with the protagonist, Dan Smith, he's a lawyer. He essentially like almost accidentally almost doxes himself by because he's on a Zoom call, and on the Zoom call or on a Teams call or a Slack call or whatever, and there's like a pop-up on his screen that is like, thank you for contributing to Donald Trump. And it's funny because that is like exactly the type of thing that like if many frogs or whatever are afraid of. I've
Yeah.
almost signed into work calls as Dan Baltic, and it's like it's interesting that we in the Jackalopians in your novel we have a yes a portrayal which in some respects is not even satire. It's not even it is a realistic portrayal of the COVID era, which is itself almost satirical, even in its realistic portrayal. So kudos to you there. It's not really a question, it's just I was going on about it. But
Yeah, thanks.
yeah, absolutely. But just to, pivot to not pivot exactly, but what is your process for writing? Writing both like, just fiction, but also something that is going to be, somewhat humorous or what have you. What's your, I like for instance with Nutcracker, I I enjoy a style where I employ dramatic irony, and I like to kind of have a situation where the reader and the author know that things are a lot crazier than the protagonist or just the characters necessarily understand.
Mhm.
And what's your process, I guess is what I'm asking here.
Yeah, so for my actual writing process, it was kind of interesting because I wrote this book really quickly. So I started it in sometime in September 2021, and I finished it on New Year's Eve of 2021. I remember um, writing the last few lines just as the clock turned over, which was kind of
Oh wow.
nice and dramatic. The last word actually that I wrote in the year 2021 was the word cleavage, which appears in the last couple of pages of the book. So I technically finished on New Year's Day, but let's not split hairs. Um, so I wrote this book extremely fast. It was actually at a time too when in my regular job I was very busy. Um, and I have a family, I have children who were still young, but even younger at the time. So I don't have a lot of free time to write. So I basically just wrote the entire book late at night, usually between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., just like pounding it out. So really, I wrote this book kind of in just a burst of passion. I think it just came to me all of a sudden, and it really yeah, it just, I don't know, it really encapsulates basically everything I think about every subject. Like it covers a lot of things about politics and religion and modern life. And I really just saw it as kind of my statement on everything that's important in the world right now, which is like yeah, I mean that's a lot to say, but yeah, it really just all came kind of pouring out. So I wrote it like that really quickly. I sketched out a pretty comprehensive outline of the whole thing before I did it. Um, and in the end, the outline was really true to what the actual book was. All the same plot points are the same. There were certain characters who didn't appear in the outline who kind of blew up more in the book, or people who were just
Mm,
mentioned in the outline that then I found actual good uses for them in the book when they were really just started off as a subsidiary character. But really for this, I just kind of wrote out the whole thing beforehand, like 7 pages of just what's everything that's going to happen in this book.
mm.
And then the writing process was just basically staying up late at night every night for like 3 months, just filling it out. Um, so it was good. It was a a real labor of love, because I have lots of other things to be doing. So
Yeah.
I could have been sleeping or doing anything else, and I wrote this instead.
No, it's interesting to me that you are a late at night writer guy because I have always, to the extent that I can, I like to write in the morning. Sometimes work makes it difficult, but if I can, pull it off and like on weekends, if I'm writing in the morning. And if, during a weekday, if I can get to bed early the night before and wake up at 6 or you know, God, I don't think I've woken up earlier except for a flight in recent times. But
Yeah.
if I could wake up at 6 and get some good writing in, that's a win in my book. Because by the end of the day, I just kind of feel like there's so much going on in my head, so much stuff I have to remember from the day, so much, kind of like, oh, well, what am I doing the next day? Whereas in the morning, like, yes, I know what's on the agenda that day, but if I wake up early enough, I know I have a buffer zone before people start emailing me and expecting a response. So I can just kind of like, have that time to write. And my mind is still unpolluted. It's still, I just woke up. I don't have, the kind of the, you know, concerns from clients or whoever, whatever, racing through my head yet. Maybe memories of it or, knowing what is going to be on the table that day. But, you know, the, the slate is clean, so to say. But you prefer the evenings. So how does that work for you? Because like at the end of the day, like are you not tired, or if you are, I guess you just power through it?
Yeah. Well, it's different when you have kids, of course, because when you
Sure,
have
yeah.
kids, I'm never going to be able to wake up earlier than them and be productive before then. So that's just a losing battle. I think for me, I mean, I've always been a nighttime person anyway, but really for me, this is the only option if I ever wanted to do it. And
I
really, I
see.
mean, for writing the Jackalopians, I didn't find it to be difficult at all. It really, the whole thing really just kind of poured out of me. So I never had that problem. I think right now, as I mentioned before we started recording, I have been working on my second book. That one, it's a little,
Congratulations.
thank you. That one's a little bit more difficult. Sometimes I, lose focus at the end of the day or don't want to do it or something. That one, it's also, it's a very different book. It's more complex in some of its issues. It's a little more difficult to write. I think
Mm.
it will be just as easy for the reader to read and enjoy, but it's a little bit more difficult to write. So that one's a little bit of a slog, but at least for the Jackalopians, it was really an initial burst of energy that I just pushed through, and this was like all I cared about. And then during the day, um, while I was doing anything else, I was just thinking about, oh man, I can't wait to get home and write the Jackalopians.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
So you noted during your talk on process that you like to storyboard things and outline them. And when I'm writing fiction, I do that. But at a certain point, I I had to at many junctures change the outline just because when I was there with the character, the outline didn't, what I believed the character would do when I got to that juncture, having like written the character into being, I realized like Spencer wouldn't do that, the protagonist from Nutcracker. So how do you find that in terms of you write an outline and since the beginning of the outline, you've built up the characters, you filled in their psychology, their details. Did they follow the plans you set?
Yeah, for the Jackalopians, definitely. For my second book, I've revised it a lot more, kind of as you say, but I still kept to the basic outline.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, for the Jackalopians, it really was extremely true to the actual story, and it was basically there were some things I filled out. Like, I don't know, I don't think the Jackalopians is a very long book, but I think it's probably on the long side for the whole dissident lit scene. It's 317 pages. There were certain pieces that I expanded hugely from the outline, like the whole flashback scene to Haji, who's one of the main characters, is his college experience. And the outline, this was one chapter. In the final book, it was like 9 chapters and like 70 pages. So like
Oh
things like
yeah.
that, I expanded a lot. Certain important characters. Did like the character of Katie, who was the girlfriend that the guy had during COVID, wasn't included in the outline at all, and that whole thing just kind of expanded out as I was writing, which is kind of interesting because I think a lot of people in their reviews seem to fixate on that whole relationship aspect. And I think that was probably one of the most memorable parts of the book. But in the outline, it was just kind of hinted at in like a sentence. So there was a lot of fleshing it out. There was a lot of parts about, you know, this one thing happens and then another thing happens later, and you
Yeah.
need to, as you're writing, you need to kind of fill in the connector. There are a lot of some of the kind of subsidiary cast of characters. I would, as I was writing, I would find better ways to plug them in certain areas. But yeah, overall, I think, you know, my writing strategy for this panned out pretty well. It was, yeah, it gave a lot of structure to write it. And I think the problem for people who haven't written anything before but want to is, you know, sometimes to be too unstructured. Like you have to think in a certain way, like not like an artist. Like you have to actually map things out in an autistic kind of lawyerly manner. Otherwise, you know, you can just go off and never really pull it together.
Yeah. Absolutely. It yeah, I mean there's like a certain like a novel is a union of discipline, but also artistry. And
Yeah.
it's I mean that's one of the reasons I feel that you have so many creative and talented people who never write novels, couldn't write a novel, and are like scared to do so because it's such a disciplined act. So it's something that you need to kind of have both qualities, I feel, and especially to be a professional that works long hours and writes in the evenings. Like kudos to you for pulling that off because it's frankly tough to write a novel even if you don't have a demanding job, but really tough if
Yeah.
you do.
Yeah.
For the I mean, you've mentioned characters that are were not necessarily supposed to be big characters or didn't even exist at all until you started writing, like Katie, which I was a bit surprised by because I saw the end, and I don't know to what extent we want to give spoilers or not, but I saw Katie as important for the narrative arc of I guess you could call him, if not the hero of the novel, the protagonist in a certain sense, the guy whose POV we're assuming, Dan Smith. Katie seemed important to his development.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's how it turned out in the final form. I
Okay.
think so. I think the kind of the basic structure of it is that we're following the point of view of a guy named Dan Smith, and then he gets involved in this group called the Jackalopians, and he starts finding out about all of their many adventures. The Jackalopians are led by a guy whose name is Haji LaRue, which I thought was a funny name when I wrote
Oh
it.
yeah.
But
Yeah, I like that.
is so Haji, it's an Islam reference, but he's like a white Chad type guy, who Haji is just kind of his Jackalopian title. He, I think, is kind of the hero of the novel, but in a
Yeah.
sense, it's following the arc of both him and Dan kind of in parallel tracks as they are forced to confront the real evil of the modern world. And then the whole drama of the novel is seeing how that manifests itself in their individual lives. So the ending, it kind of ends in a climax with Dan and Katie, which this is the problem that's been following Dan around for his entire time through the novel, where he broke up with this girl during COVID, and now he's basically just simping about her and just thinking about her constantly and wanting her back, even though by the time the action of the novel is really going on, it's been like, the year and a half, I guess, since they broke up. So it's really, so part of the one of the storylines is Dan's ability to overcome being a simp, and then the other storyline is kind of Haji's more heroic ascent, but they're both kind of ascents in their own way. And I think the Katie thing that kind of developed just as I went along, like that the ending was originally different when I was planning it out. It wasn't going to have that final ending, but as I was getting further into the novel, I thought that would be kind of a good way to wrap up that whole story.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was, that was a very an ending that, helped to tie everything together. And you kind of see the protagonist um, demonstrate personal growth by, you know, spoiler alert, to by turning down Katie at the end and embracing if not embracing religion, embracing a more, you know, a moral lifestyle. And that, yeah, I thought that was a very well done ending. And I was wondering, characters such as, Katie, but also like some of the other characters were, favorites of mine. And where did they come from? So I think Haji LaRue, like that's a great name. That's a great, and you characterized him very well. I had a real sense of who he is. I had a real sense of who Carnahan was. And one of the ones that grabbed my attention the most was Todd Sneedman, who is this kind of Spencer Grunhauer like figure who attempts to kind of not even attempts to, he like almost in some sense succeeds in taking over the Jackalopians group and wresting control from Haji LaRue. And he's does it because of a fit of pique about LaRue's refusal and the group's refusal to accept some arcane point of Jackalopian lore and terminology. So yeah, where did Todd Sneedman come from?
Yeah,
And did you enjoy writing him?
I did enjoy writing him. I think Todd Sneedman is probably my favorite character from the book, just because I think he's probably the funniest. But yeah, I think he is kind of a Spencer Grunhauer type figure. It's a type of figure that we probably know all too well if you're on Twitter or involved in any kind of right-wing politics. You see a lot of these just completely autistic people around. So it's kind of, I mean, it's a lot. I think it's a lot like the protagonist from Nutcracker, but just as more of a minor figure. So he's another one that I kind of spun out and found new ways to integrate him into the story as it went forward. But I do think just the archetype of the just weirdo autist is really the gift that never stops giving. I think some of his scenes in the book are really the funniest. And it is really just going to like a contemporary archetype where it's the guy who just destroys everything because he cares so much about this one thing that doesn't matter at all and that nobody else really cares about. Like the whole point of the Jackalopian group is just all these people like to just go and like get drunk,
Yeah,
have fun
exactly.
together. And he is just fixated on this point of doctrine, to the point that he ultimately will just destroy everything to have his way on it.
Yeah. Yeah, just a concern about his own personal power. but also his own sense of like, well, I am right, and because I'm right, I have to go to the absolute wall on this particular issue or point. And I believe the point was whether a flying jackalope is a real jackalope.
Yes.
And he characterizes it as a heresy, and he a heresy that's like propagated or of a class of jackalope heresies that are espoused by people called Wolpertingerists. Is that
Yes.
right?
That's right.
Is that a real thing
Yeah,
or
yeah, you can Google all of this stuff. This is all real.
really?
The the Wolpertinger is a real thing. The Wolpertingerist heresy is made up for purposes of the book. But flying jackalopes are real. Wolpertingers are real. And it's what I think of is funny about this is because I think his point is that the group um, this is really getting into the details of the book, but that in the past, the group had denounced this type of creature, the Wolpertinger, as like a heretical type of creature
Yeah,
that's not recognized by the Jackalopian group. If you look at a picture side by side of the flying jackalope and the Wolpertinger, they actually do look extremely similar. So he's pointing out, like many autistic people, he's pointing out something that is actually true. And he is actually right if you're taking their premises as stated.
yeah,
That they should all oppose this thing too. But what he's missing is the fact that they just said that earlier because they thought it was funny, and now they just want to like get drunk and like get
yeah,
laid. And so he is really missing the forest for the trees.
yeah. The social context, he's just like not, and so that is very similar to Spencer Grunhauer and Nutcracker. The though you he might be right, the Sneedman might be right in respect of the actual thing. The context is one in which they pursue vindication in a manner that is just incredibly annoying or just destructive, and means that like even though you were right in on doctrine, you're wrong because you're gonna lose because
Yeah.
you've failed to behave normally.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's actually a lot of interesting parallels between Nutcracker and the Jackalopians. They were actually released the same week.
Oh, really? I
Yeah.
didn't know
So
that.
yeah,
Huh.
mine was released November 18th, 2022. I think yours was
The
released.
11th, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. So
I think it
7 days
was,
apart.
yeah, Veterans Day.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I mean, pretty close. And I mean, I think they're kind of on similar topics. The Sneedman part of my book, I think he was my favorite character because I think he's the funniest, and his scenes were the most fun to write because it's just so easy to lampoon people like that. But I mean, he's a relatively minor character, maybe not minor, but maybe kind of like second or third tier. So it's
Yeah.
not the focus of the book, but it is the same type of character as in Nutcracker, and they are. I mean, there are two books that are really timely, really kind of ripped from the headlines um, that are just about kind of all the absurdity of the modern world. So I think there's a lot of strange serendipity between these two books.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons I felt a real kind of kinship, a real sort of draw to the Jackalopians. Part of which was, well, there are not too many of us out here on the this side of the internet, dissident Twitter, whatever you want to call it, who are writing satires or so writing stories that are in some respects comic or what have you, that are also simultaneously like dealing with uh, the current year in some way or form. And yeah, so I saw immediate parallels, and it's I hope that as time goes on, we'll see more and more. and that we are the pioneers of a growing
Yep.
field. Because frankly, the mainstream, the traditional publishing industry, they would never publish something like Nutcracker or the Jackalopians just because it's politically not on the right page for them. Even though like I suppose some liberals could read our novels and maybe it wouldn't be entirely clear what side we come down on, or I mean, at least in the case of Nutcracker, it
I
might
think
not
for
be in,
yours.
yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah,
don't
it
know
might
that many
not.
liberals will read mine, but
True.
yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, that being said, like for, various reasons, we would not make it in the current mainstream publishing world, which is to say that I don't think there many of the satires, like, in order to actually satirize the current year, you really have to be outside of mainstream publishing because it's really hard. Though I mean, like, so I think Mike White, the guy who did White Lotus, which is a TV show, obviously not a novel, but yeah, it's hard to actually be able to criticize the system when you're in the system, and as a result, I think the best and the only real satire is going to come from where we are. So I think we're actually in a very good position, and I hope and I suspect that many others will join us here in writing not only kind of heroic um, stories about um, protagonists overcoming a dystopian future. That we will also have more satirical novels that kind of reclaim the mantle from the mainstream and traditional publishing world and do what they can't do.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. So the first thing I would say, just everybody who's listening to that, if you bought Nutcracker and liked it, then you should certainly also read the Jagalopians because they are spiritually very similar. So quick, go and buy it now. But
Absolutely. Buy
um,
book.
yeah, but I mean, separately, I think that's all right. I mean, we're saying that our books wouldn't be published by a mainstream publisher, which I think is certainly correct. But I don't think either of our books is at all radical. Like, I think
No,
my book is much more moderate, probably than I am personally. There's like nothing in there that would be out of step with anything a mainstream Republican would have believed even in like maybe 2008, let alone like the 90s or something. Um,
absolutely.
it's it's unpublishable now because it's opposed to all the shibboleths of the left, but it's really actually, I think perfectly moderate book. But yeah, I mean, in terms of otherwise, yeah, I think a lot of part of what inspired me to write it too was that I think there's a lot of people in our scene who are writing genre fiction, like sci-fi, horror, things like that, which if that's what you're interested in, that's great. Like I certainly think that anybody should be pursuing the things that interest them. But it's never really done that much for me. And I think that really, if you want to write something meaningful, you have to kind of grapple with the actual issues of our time. And
Yeah,
that means basically just writing about the modern world and what's going on now. So there's a lot of debate in some of these kind of dissident literary type outlets about how political art should be. I don't know that I would even call what I've written art. I think it's entertaining,
mm,
but I mean, it's clearly political and it clearly has a political message. But I think that you have to write that kind of thing. Like people when they're complaining about art being too political, I think they're thinking about people like Ben Shapiro writing a spy novel or something like that. They're
yeah,
thinking of the cringe aspects of it, but they're not thinking about all of the great political art that's been written, like 1984 and Atlas Shrugged, they may have their problems, but these are clearly books that made a huge impact on the world. Some of my other favorites, like The Power and the Glory by Graham
Oh
Greene,
yeah, I love that
um,
one.
about like the persecution of the Catholic Church by the socialists in Mexico, which was something that was going on at the time that he was writing the book. It was something that he observed personally, but it's clearly a book with a political statement. And it's also high literature that's really entertaining to read and really deep, and actually has made, I think, made a profound impact on my own life. But things like that are, I think, are what we should be aiming for. That to me is more worthwhile, both of the limited time I have to write something and the limited time that other people have to read,
Absolutely.
to write about things that really make an actual impact on the world and that speak directly to the issues that we all face in the modern world, as opposed to just purely creating something that's a fun aspect of a genre.
Absolutely. And one further distinction is the mainstream publishing industry, their heroes will not be the same as our heroes, but they can still tell heroic tales. They can still tell, they can still do sci-fi in their own way. They just, switch who the heroes and villains are. They can still do fantasy. They can still do even like detective stories or whatever. The one thing they can't do is satire. They can't
Mm.
satire because satire involves a kind of connection to the current political moment, and you have to be able to kind of poke fun at the shibboleths of the current year, and they can't do that. I mean,
Yeah,
like they, to an extent, yes, the Mike Whites of the world. There are probably a few novelists that are semi-mainstream that do that. Sam Lipsyte, to an extent, maybe used to be one. There's a few others I have been meaning to read. Um, uh, Fuckboy by Sean Thor Corot or something like that.
I
He's
haven't heard
he,
of that one.
yeah, he is published by the mainstream press more or less. There's like a whole controversy over whether he ripped some indie people off. I'm not going to weigh in on that right now on this pod, but regardless, so like there's a little bit, but in general, they really, if you are in the mainstream entertainment industry, publishing, film, TV, what have you, you have to, if you are satirizing the current year, you have to do what Strauss calls writing between the lines. You have to, insinuate your critiques without stating them baldly, because if you stated them baldly, you would be excommunicated. And what we can do outside of that world is we can just actually have like a swing for the fences satire. And frankly, I'm excited by what this sphere will produce, because to an extent, I don't know to what extent, if any, but to an extent, for me, I was holding back when I wrote Nutcracker because
Mhm.
I had pretensions of it being, successful in the mainstream publishing industry. And now that I know that I have a readership and that, I don't need to succeed in that world, um, I can actually just, really like go balls to the wall. And I'm looking forward to that. And I hope you do too in your next novel, which I believe you've already finished, but I'm sure it's,
Yep.
quite impressive. And many of our listeners who are writers and writing satires, just, go for it, because there's so much, it's just, there's so much material out there and it's so juicy. Just get it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I don't know that I held anything back in my book. I think if anything, I may have overextended myself in parts. Although I mean, there's nothing that's really too edgy or anything, but I never even considered submitting it to any other publisher. I always just assumed, like, why not just publish it myself? I'm not going to waste time
Yeah,
like shopping it to agents or something, when you can just put it on Amazon and just blast it out. But yeah, I agree. I think that there's a real lack of kind of effective satire in books kind of addressing the modern world from our perspective, and that was the gap that I was trying to fill with this. So hopefully more people will be doing that. It's scary because we're up against bad people, and the more, the more truth you write, the more blowback that there could be by people who don't like being the subject of your attacks.
that's
But
true.
it's not the worst. It's not the scariest thing. There's other worse things you could be doing. And ultimately, I think it's worth it. I think you have to kind of leave your mark on the times that you live in. And especially, I mean, I have kids, as I said before. I want to be able to leave a testament that even while I was living in this world, I didn't agree with it. And I have this now piece of physical proof that I can show to my children and future generations to say that I stood against the times.
Absolutely. And one thing, I don't know to what extent you subscribe to this or have thought about it, but it's a lot easier to be a dissident artist than a dissident activist, shall we say. So at the end of the day, though, like, it's, totally possible that people come after you for, things you say on an arts and culture podcast or things that you write about in your novels. There's a sense of, I feel like, even if, someone tried to cause an uproar, it's like, well, it's a novel, it's fiction, it's, and though, people will try to, like, quote unquote cancel each other for anything, there's a sense that I feel like if you're not really in the arena trying to, like, make political change happen on the ground, like that's when these people start going crazy. So that's when they get activated. Like
Hmm.
if you're, you know trying to, like, organize votes and stuff of that nature, or you're
Yeah.
trying to put up like a political candidate, then they're like, oh damn, well, Soros calls up the troops and gets them like mobilized. But if it's a novel, I don't know. I don't. I think that, like, it's a little dangerous. It's a little edgy, but I think at the end of the day, um, we have a lot of leeway as
Yeah.
artists.
Yeah, we're protected by the fact that not everybody's going to be willing to read an entire novel just to find ways to
Exactly.
attack you.
Yeah.
Um, and I think also I'm trying to, I kind of protect myself too. It's a thing that Bronze Age Pervert talks about, where he talks about that he deliberately named himself that because it makes his enemies seem ridiculous when they attack him, when they are complaining about the threat of a guy named Bronze Age Pervert. I think it's kind of a little bit the same with my book.
Oh yeah.
If people are going
Absolutely.
around talking about how there's a new book called The Jackalopians, a Modern Tale that's anti-democracy, uh, you know, people are just going to laugh them off and
Yeah.
think that they sound insane.
Yeah. Like Nutcracker, the threat to our establishment.
Yeah.
It's just not, it doesn't really pass the credibility test.
No, and there are certain scenes that I deliberately inserted just because I thought that the idea was hilarious of some Politico writer reading these in the future, just trying to mine out little quips to be able to complain about it or write a hit piece on. I don't know that I would ever be important enough for them to do that, but I think it's kind of a funny idea when you think about some of the really insane stuff that happens in this book.
Oh,
The,
absolutely.
the idea that anybody could be reading this with an eye to smear it as fascism, I think is would be very funny.
Absolutely. One of should we get into the actual kind of scandal that kind of ignites the climax of the
Yeah, that'd be
novel,
great.
which
Yeah.
is where one of the members of the Jackalopian Club, he accidentally So he has like a parlor trick to impress women. First of all, his name is the Baron. He's like a Colombian aristocrat. He is a Casanova type of guy, very good looking. Women love him, and he has a trick where he tosses a cigarette in the air, catches it, and puts it out on his tongue. And he's doing this for girls on the way home from some bar, and he accidentally like misses it, and it hits this kind of like in this house we believe in science sign, and winds up setting the sign on fire. And he's trying to put the fire out, and then the people in the house come out, and he runs away. And he is later branded as some sort of um, not only right-wing vigilante, but the people in the house where they believe in science, they took the opportunity to capitalize upon this event, and they've claimed that he's a member of the new Ku Klux Klan, and that they've been attacked by Klansmen, and this becomes something that the media repeats, and it gets a lot of attention. And so suddenly a member of this kind of almost apolitical social drinking club, the Jackalopian Order, he finds himself in the crosshairs of the regime, whatever you want to call it. And it's quite the sticky situation, wouldn't you say, Mark?
Yeah, that's right. That's a very good summary of the story. And I think, the absurdity is added, of course, because this is like a Colombian aristocrat,
Yes.
not anything that you would imagine a Ku Klux Klan member to be. But yeah, that's the catalyst for the real kind of external action of the story that then involves events kind of spin out of control, and the whole Jackalopian group needs to find a way to somehow rescue him from all of this media attention.
Absolutely. It's a
So
hilarious plot point.
yeah, I mean, I think it's something that's really highlighting the world as it exists today, because I mean, it's obviously silly and a little bit over the top, but it's something that you could imagine happening.
Oh yeah.
Like a lot of these hate hoaxes that we see aren't really that much crazier than this. It just some lady yells at a black kid somewhere and it gets caught on camera, and suddenly the entire media is talking about this. It's the same basic issue that we've seen over and over. So it's real. It really is. It goes to speak to the nature of the times we live in. But the point of the book, I think, really, as I said in the beginning, it's about the arc of the two guys, Haji and Dan, and that we spend the first half of the book talking about how not necessarily miserable they are, but how Dan is kind of stuck in this rut of just big law work, porn, having a girlfriend that he still is in love with. And Haji, who we haven't really talked about yet, is kind of stuck in a similar rut where he is, by outward appearances, a cool Chad who gets laid a lot. But kind of inwardly, we learn that he grew up as a very pious Catholic boy who then, once he went off to college, was so shaken by his experiences of the big city and the kind of libtard people who populate ostensibly Catholic schools that it shook him in his faith. And now he's basically become a nihilist who, while still, right wing, I guess, in a sense, is mainly just interested in, having sex and getting drunk. And
Yeah.
it's kind of the catalyst of the story then is this experience with the Baron, where now suddenly things are real and they're really kind of confronted with the evil of the modern world, and they need to find a way where life isn't all just about fun and games and going to fun jackalope meetings. There's also real dark forces at play in the world, and you need to really kind of understand your place in it and rise up to the occasion.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk a bit about narrative format. So, a lot of this story is narrative that's delivered by Scott to Dan in a kind of retelling of the history and the tales of Haji Leroy and or Haji LaRue or
That's how
LaRoy.
I pronounce
All
it, but
right.
I guess it's just spelled.
Lur
So it
Yeah,
could be anything.
in either case. So what motivated you to use that narrative form as opposed to like a third person, just kind of omniscient, or a first person? What was the motivation?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I think this is maybe one of the weirder things about the book. So just I guess so everybody understands. So the book is narrated in the first person by Dan. But then once he joins the Jackalopians, he makes friends with a guy named Scott, who is kind of the third of the main characters of Dan, Haji, and Scott. And the huge sections, probably the bulk of the book, are told in Scott narrating kind of flashback episodes to Dan where they're just sitting around and he's telling him all about the things that happened with the Jackalopians in the past, and he's about all the important points of the story. So um that is like a weird way to do things where all of a sudden in the middle of the narrator switches and it becomes the first person from a different guy's perspective who's just talking to the original narrator about a third guy. But I don't know. I thought it was, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting in a few ways. So one of the things, just taking a step back, is one of the immediate inspiration for writing this book was I read a story called The Jay Nights by Rudyard Kipling, which is a short story. It's quoted in the beginning of the book, like it's kind of like the epigram,
Oh
whatever
yeah,
it
I
is,
noticed
at the
that.
beginning.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a nod that I didn't just completely steal this. I'm giving a little bit of credit. But The Jay Nights is a story about a group of people, of British soldiers during World War I, who form secret Jane Austen society to like read Jane Austen books and have all these weird rituals about Jane Austen as kind of a way to escape from the horrors of the war. It's a very good story. I would recommend everybody read it.
Interesting.
It's only like 30 pages, although it is written in dialect, so it's like Cockney, like the whole thing is like "Oi, bruv," this kind of thing. So it's a little bit difficult to read, but that was the immediate inspiration, and it was once I read that, I just kind of thought like, well, how would this be structured if it occurred in America in 2021? And that's kind of where the idea for my book came from. But The Jay Nights is also kind of structured in the same way, where it's a guy who meets this group and he's talking to one of the members of the group, and most of the story is this group member narrating all the things that happened in their past. It makes a little bit more sense there because it's a short story, so it's like 30 pages and it's not that crazy for somebody to be talking for that long. But I do think it's kind of an interesting way of structuring the story, and it was actually something that was done occasionally in that same kind of time period, like the early 20th century, late 19th century. Like the book Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad is written entirely in the same way. So just like the Jackalopians, it's like 300 pages of a guy talking to another guy, and everything is in quotation marks. And it's just like, completely defies belief that somebody would be talking for that long. But I think it's kind of cool because it reflects like a type of Chad disdain for realism, and just like, I'm going to do this way because it's kind of cool type thing that you really don't see anymore. But for whatever
Absolutely.
reason, people were doing it in that time period. Another interesting example of this, a little bit different, is the book Dracula, which is written entirely as like diary entries. So I don't know. I think I'm not going to write my second book like this. My second book is just third person. But it's an interesting thing to experiment with, that people used to in that time period experiment more with these just like weirdly, bizarrely complicated ways of structuring a story. And I think if you pull it off, it's a real flex because it's saying like I added this whole weird level of complication for no reason. It doesn't really it doesn't really make the story better. It's just a weird thing that I added, but it's still good.
Yeah.
And I think that hopefully it doesn't detract from my book.
No,
It's
not at
just
all. Yeah.
it's a thing that's like a weird kind of thing that people think like, huh, I wonder why I did that. That's kind of weird. But it's still good.
The really cool thing about that, from my perspective, is that you get to incorporate in a natural way different points of view. Whereas, sometimes you'll have third person omniscient, but it gets close on one character, then close on another. And it's kind of like, well, who is really telling this story? How does this person know this? How does this person know that? Or maybe it is first person, but then suddenly you're in like someone else's head or some suddenly. So this provides a kind of like a logically consistent world where you're in Dan's head, but when Dan is, listening to stories told to him by Scott, you're receiving Scott's, uh, views, his, you're seeing the world for that section from Scott's eyes. So it allows you to really kind of experiment with combining multiple POVs in a way that isn't just kind of like, screw it, we're just going to do it. We're not going to explain why. This, there's a reason. There's a reason why there
Yeah.
are two POVs.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to kind of have your cake and eat it too, where you're using the first person point of view, but you're kind of getting around its limitations in certain ways by just switching the narrator to someone else. Um, so yeah, I liked
Exactly.
it. I think it's important to do it. We start out with Dan and then to switch to Scott rather than Haji, even though Haji is really the true hero of the novel. I think because Scott is another just regular normal guy. He's kind of portrayed as kind of a guy who's smart and understands all the issues of the modern world and probably has good based takes, but is a little kind of practical minded materialist, doesn't really have the real inner spiritual drama that someone like Haji has. So Haji is really the like the Ubermensch of the story. He's like the guy who really sees all the
Yeah.
issues and transcends the modern world. But I mean like a first person because
Yeah.
that type of person is unrelatable to most people. So I think it's important it's filtered through the perspective of Scott, who is describing this really cool guy, without himself being the one who experienced all these things.
Absolutely. And the kind of so it kind of in some respects reminded me of Nick Carraway's role in The Great Gatsby as the
Mm-hmm.
kind of like relatable everyman who explains this kind of fantastic story. And that is, kind of how I viewed both Dan and Scott to a certain extent. They serve as these kind of like anchors for the reader into a story of, people and personalities that are, more unusual, who,
Mm-hmm.
who wouldn't really be appropriate as you wouldn't have the Great Gatsby with Jay Gatsby as the narrator, because that would just, it would demystify him. It
Yeah.
would make him not as cool. So if Haji LaRue were the narrator, it would just, he'd cease to be. You'd see all his insecurities, you'd see et cetera, et cetera. It's better in some ways, I think, if you're going to write a novel like that, where the close third or the first person is on not the Ubermensch, but on the observer, the person who is the bridge between the readers and the unapproachable hero archetype.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I never thought about it in terms of The Great Gatsby, but I think that's right. Um, so yeah, yep, that's what I tried to do.
And you did it very well.
Thank you.
Moving on to book marketing. So
Mhm.
that's something that before Nutcracker, before New Right, I never even really thought much about that. But now I see that there's an art to it. There's especially, I mean, we exist in a world where you have the mainstream publishing industry that has, a lot of ad spend and resources to, help novels and what have you reach their readers, their audience. And regardless, they don't really seem to do a very good job of it, except for with the very biggest of big titles. And for the smaller presses, they can't help you with that at all, really.
Yeah.
So we're in a situation right now where artists, writers, you're kind of on your own, but you have the tools to do better, to have more control over your sales, more control over the number of your readers, your voice than ever before, because through Twitter, other social media outlets, you can promote yourself and not only promote yourself, but become your ad campaign manager. So like my whole, thank you for getting that nut line and stuff like that, and the various kind of promotional tweets that something like Nutcracker gives lends itself to it. It becomes something that frankly becomes a bit of an art form in and of itself, at least for me. So how have you
Yeah.
found your experience trying to market Jackalopians, and what is your style, shall we say?
Yeah, I think that's all right. And so my experience of marketing the Jackalopians has really been going on Twitter and just posting about it every day and trying to just get bigger accounts and other people
Mm.
interested. I do agree. I think there's a lot of potential there that doesn't exist in mainstream publishing, and that a lot of these other people aren't really going to promote you the way you can promote yourself. So really, I mean, going on Twitter, the sky is the limit as long as you can get people to read your book. I think I've done fine. Every time, it truly is a great honor anytime anybody buys my book, because
Mm.
it's $17. You could spend that $17 on anything, and the fact that you decided to spend it on reading my book really really means a lot to me. And I think that that's absolutely great. So everybody who has bought the book, I am hugely appreciative of. I hope to sell a lot more. I haven't sold nearly as many as I would like. But really, I think that's just all kind of getting a foothold in this kind of Twitter marketing campaign. I don't know really, I don't know where else I would go other than that to market it. But ultimately, too, I think that it's not just a book that should appeal to the online types. I myself am very online, a millennial, have been on the internet for a while. I kind of that's what most naturally appeals to me. But I think that there is a large segment of normies who would profit from this book too and would like it. Like, there's no reason why your Trump supporting uncle wouldn't enjoy reading this book just because it's fun and it hits on all the right notes that he probably supports too. So I would like to expand beyond Twitter, but I think that right now Twitter probably has the best platform to do something like this. Um, but it's dangerous too, because Twitter, while it offers great benefits, it also has a lot of real downsides. Like, you can really get sucked in on completely unproductive things on that.
Oh yeah.
you
Yeah.
can waste tons of time just scrolling. And so you have to be really intentional. But if you do it the right way, it can be good.
Absolutely. I believe it was Tacos who said this, and I forget on which pod exactly, but he said something to the effect of, if you want people to read your book, first get famous for something else. And
Yeah.
I kind of took that to heart. And part of, I love New Right. I love having these conversations. But in the back of my mind, when I was forming it, Nutcracker hadn't come out yet, and I realized you need a platform to sell people your writing. And so that, I think we have kind of unprecedented tools right now to build a platform, be it
Yeah.
Twitter, be it like starting a podcast, be it, you know, I don't know. Even, starting my girlfriend was showing me TikTok videos and saying like this woman's an influencer and she makes 5 million a year. And I'm like, I want to kill someone. That's I can't fucking believe that.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's true. There's unprecedented access to, people's minds now. And I think like to the extent that like it's a kind of dual mission of a writer these days is like build a platform so you can be a successful writer. And I mean, part of it is also so like there's so much that goes into getting your work out there these days. And I am frankly I'm happy with this model because it gives you more control. It puts it in your hands. But in some ways, do I wish we could rewind to the 90s where a novel like Nutcracker could be published? And I'd have like a publishing deal and an agent, and I wouldn't have to be a lawyer. Yeah, that actually might be pretty cool. I would, ultimately have to, do what my agents and publishers say, and I wouldn't be able to, write as freely as I want to. But yeah, it's kind of it's a real trade-off, but at least in today's world, I wouldn't have it any other way because, if you're an author in the traditional publishing industry, if you have anything interesting to say, good luck saying it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's too bad about the whole um the transition from the 90s when you had people like Stephen King or John Grisham who could just become fabulously wealthy writing novels.
Yeah,
And I think there's obviously there's downsides to that, but it's still a much better job than like 99.9% of the public has otherwise. So yeah, you have to take the good with the bad. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is a good model for our time. The other thing that's important is that if you're self-publishing a book, as opposed to even going with a small publisher, you do keep the copyright to that. So a lot of publishing houses, it's fine in the beginning, but they don't necessarily need to keep publishing your book 10 years down the road. And if they decide to just take it out of circulation, there's nothing you can do about it. But if you just decide to run it through Amazon direct to print, you own the copyright and that's your property. You can pass that on to your children. It's yours and nobody can prevent you from just continuing to publish it. Except maybe Amazon if they decide to yank your
absolutely.
permission, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would urge any listeners who are thinking about publishing deals, you should not assign your copyright to a publisher. You should always try to hold on to your copyright. Um, a good publishing deal is one where you keep your own copyright and they have the right to potentially publish it indefinitely, but also if it's been out of publication for a number of years, you have the right to then kind of buy it back. That is what you should pursue.
Yeah.
But there are
But it's
certainly
not always
more.
an option. Yeah.
True, it's not always an option, and there are certainly more onerous deals out there. So, yeah, in any case, your ability to exploit your work will be markedly, constricted if you have a deal with the publishing company. That is certainly the truth.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think the point you made about delicious tacos, that the best way to sell a book is to be famous already. I think that's definitely true. I would probably sell more books if I were already famous. But the other thing is, I mean, it takes a lot of work to run a podcast or to build up a huge Twitter account, or any of these kind of things. They give you a platform to be famous already. Yeah. If I had waited to do that, I probably never would have written a book. So I just
Yeah,
decided that, like, might as well just write it and see what happens. And
absolutely.
maybe it won't sell any copies, but um even if it doesn't, I had fun. And I think that's a good mindset for people to have. If you set up too many roadblocks in your path to before you're willing to actually pull the trigger on something, it's just a reason to never do it. So
No,
you know
that's very true.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely a bias toward action is something that's helpful in pretty much any situation. So yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. We're getting on a little over 1.5 hours, so I thought maybe we would close it out on a discussion of religion's role in the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Is
so oh, sorry.
no,
I
go
was,
ahead. Yeah.
yeah, no. So I was gonna say I would be interested to hear what you think about this. I I don't know whether the Jackalopians is a religious novel or not. I've debated this point with my wife. We have different views on whether it is. But ultimately, I mean, I am a Catholic. I am a Catholic convert, which many people I don't know, Catholic converts get a bad rap, but my family was historically Catholic, but my parents, very liberal, raised me as an atheist, and I converted to the Catholic Church later in life for reasons that are very similar to what happens to the characters in my book. And so I do see that. I mean, ultimately, I kind of see this as a religious book. I think the most literal message of it is that the Catholic Church is your path to salvation. But I understand that most of the readers of this will probably not be Catholic. Will be people I don't really get the sense. I don't really know what your religious beliefs. I get the sense you're not a particularly religious guy, but like people like Dan Baltic living in New York City, having based opinions, but probably doesn't go to church every Sunday. I think there's a lot of people like that in our scene, who would read this book, and it's not supposed to be alienating to them. There's Protestants, um, you know, atheists, pagans, Bap types, all these types, I think would still enjoy the book. But I personally am a Catholic, so I do view it as indicating that Catholicism is the best path. And that's really the track that Haji in the book takes from being kind of a pious Catholic kid to losing his faith to then kind of regaining it through spoiler alert, but regaining it through the trial by fire that he undergoes once the Jackalopians become ensnared in a hate
Yeah.
crime hoax.
Yeah, absolutely. What I found really interesting here was how Hashi's path from being pious and a believer as a child, experiencing the hypocrisy of the woke church under people like Father Slippenstein, which is a great name, by the way. It
Thank you.
Yeah, and a great character, and then pursuing a life of nihilism, of hedonism, and I think we do see a lot of that, not just religiously, but as we were talking about earlier, I think a lot of like more bro types understand that this is all kind of BS, but have just kind of said, oh, whatever, I'm just gonna try to get laid as much as I can and make as much money as I can. And to an extent, that's kind of how Nutcracker ends. But that is not decidedly not how the Jackalopians ends, because Haji he goes through a process of, yes, that disillusionment, but he experiences a sort of reawakening of religious tendency when he becomes fixated on the jackalope. And he venerates it as a kind of, and stop me if I'm wrong or if I'm mischaracterizing anything, but I believe he venerates it as a symbol of America, of the heritage America, the real America, and he venerates that. And but then later in the novel, he realizes that though the jackalope is a powerful symbol, and though America itself is a powerful symbol, that ultimately veneration is a religious impulse, and that he has to return to the church. He has to return to God. And I thought that was a very powerful message. And yeah, I mean, I think like most people who read this will understand that it is a religious novel. It's about, and again, stop me if I'm putting words
Mm.
in your mouth or misinterpreting, but I interpret it as a novel about a man's return to his faith.
Yeah, I think that's exactly correct. I mean, that's how I interpret it too. It's anybody can interpret it differently, but yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so I think the issue with the jackalope is that it's not necessarily a bad thing to be really interested in. It is a symbol of America, and the fact that he is wants to venerate this symbol of America is a very good thing because, yeah, I believe America is a very good place. At least it was. It's being turned into a bad place by bad people, but the America that the jackalope represents was a very good place, whatever its flaws. So that is a very good type of patriotism that's coming from an important place for him. But ultimately, it's no replacement for God, and he comes to realize, which is what I've come to realize too, that all our problems, I think, are at root spiritual problems, and that we've already lived through the death of God, and now we're just living in the wreckage of what came after that. So we had the Enlightenment, the age of science and reason, and tearing down all of the old, what they called the old superstitions, to clear that away to create some kind of new, more rational world. The rational world that they created then gave us like votive candles for Dr. Fauci and like riots on behalf of George Floyd. So it wasn't really what we were promised. It ended up all being replaced by just different, more malevolent cults. And I think the book is pointing
Yeah.
that out, and that ultimately Haji comes to see that, and he sees the answer to that as being returning to the Catholic faith, which is the same answer that I see. I do like people like Bap. I think Bap. I think that a lot of Bronze Age mindset inspired a lot of stuff in this book, because it really is identifying the same struggle. That I agree with him that the struggle of our world today is a struggle inside the individual soul, and that we're just being crushed down by all of these completely soul deadening impulses that want you to just be the guy who lives in the pod and eats bugs, and never to aspire to anything greater than that. So I saw at some point I saw my book as kind of a Christian take on Bronze Age mindset. I think in the end it didn't become that. It became something much different, which is much more interesting, because it's better to form your own thing than just be derivative of
Absolutely.
someone else. But also, I think you see the core of that. So I have a lot of respect for people like that. I ultimately don't agree with him when he
Yeah.
attacks Christianity, but I think there's I'll take him over a lot of other tradcaths, like some of these people like Adrian Vermeule or Sohrab Ahmari, who talk about how Catholicism is really about supporting racial socialism and and all this. So I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap. It's ultimately, I view it as a kind of Catholic book, but you certainly don't have to be Catholic to read it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly how I would characterize it as well. It's, certainly there's something in it for everyone. and it's an enjoyable ride. It's a funny ride.
Thanks. Before we go, I know we're short on time. Do you have a favorite scene or a favorite character? I'd love to hear if you do.
So yeah, I mean, my favorite scene is, I mean, perhaps somewhat predict. Well, I mean, I have a few, but somewhat predictably, I do love Sneedman, and I love the scene where he like finally is like gonna like put one over on them, and he like forces them to give up the Jackalope to hand over like the control of the Jackalopian order to him by virtue of blackmailing everyone. And yeah, it's just this kind of like a hilarious and like, in some ways like sad moment, but he's just so, full of himself and thinks he's right. And yeah, so I loved Sneedman. I thought the Katie stuff was done very well, especially how she's like still seeing this kind of like abusive lib guy and like
Mhm.
stringing Dan along. That was I thought that was very artfully done. So the there's a portion where you describe well, certainly like all the media circus that surrounds the incident, the burning of the sign. That stuff is done very well. The Father Slippenstein, when he's talking about when he's explaining to Haji how he needs to choose a subject for his paper who's more appropriate than Thomas Aquinas. And the more appropriate person is, of course, some like African, preacher who, is much less, has produced work of much less importance than Aquinas,
Yeah.
who's
Infume quasi Quaco. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Was that even a real person
No,
or, all
no.
right, yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of really good stuff here. And yeah, another scene I was gonna say was how the scene where they describe the Baron's uncle who's coming to rescue him and how he like is, one man army kind of like slaughtered hundreds of communists or something in some great battle. That I thought that was hilarious as
Yeah.
well.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean it's always interesting to give feedback like that and see what pieces resonated most with people. I will say about that Baron scene, that one, I mean, I was laughing for a lot of the scenes that you mentioned, but the Baron uncle scene, really, I was like absolutely dying laughing as I was writing that. That came to me. That was one of the ones that I didn't write at night, but I was out. My daughter was, a very young baby, and I was out pushing her in the stroller and was just going for a walk, and all of a sudden just started thinking about that whole speech that he's giving about his uncle slaughtering all the communists. And I was just dying laughing, walking down the street alone, pushing the baby stroller, and had to just quick as soon as we got home just pound out that whole thing. But yeah, I think that was one of the funniest things. I read it to my wife right after I got home and just
Amazing.
blasted it out, and we were both just cracking up the whole time. So yeah, I love that. I think my favorite scene is the when Haji falls in with the Boomer motorcycle gang. I
Oh
think that's
yeah,
one of
no,
the funniest.
yeah,
There,
that's good too.
there's a lot of good stuff to talk about. Everybody needs to just read it. The Jackalopians by Mark Marlow. If you put that into Amazon, there's no other books with any similar title to that. So it's easy to find. And
we
you can follow me on Twitter at Jackalopians.
Yeah, we are gonna promote it in the episode show notes. We will, obviously promote it by tweet when the episode comes out. But you should all buy book, buy the Jackalopians, a modern tale. It is, as Mark says, available on Amazon. Follow Mark on Twitter and stay tuned for his upcoming novel, his second novel, which
That's right.
is you are really a fast writer. You've got another one coming out very soon. Anything you want to plug right now in addition?
No, that's it. Yeah, all I really have are my book and my Twitter account. So if you just buy the book and follow me on Twitter, you'll have everything you need. But keep, um, keep a lookout. My second book will be released in, I'm thinking probably the spring or early summer of 2024. It's going to be very timely, especially for the 2024 election. It's a very similar vibe to the Jackalopians, a very different story with completely different characters, but it covers many similar themes. So if you like the Jackalopians, this is just as good. I think it's just there's a lot of humor, there's a lot of serious stuff. It's an outrageous plot. So keep a lookout, and it'll be released soon.
I'm predicting it now. This is going to be one of the big novels about the 2024 election, at least on our side of Twitter. I'm calling it here because I think it's going to have a lot to offer.
Thanks. I hope so.
All right. Signing off now. But thank you for coming on, Mark. It was great.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.